South Africa's economic growth rate over the past decade has been amongst the worst in the world. The Reserve Bank says the performance ranks on par with countries that suffered major disasters and war. Considering South Africa has had relative peace inside its borders and amongst its neighbours, this outcome is worse than 90% of other economies. In terms of inflation, the country has not fared much better, with it averaging an annual headline inflation rate of 5% for the past 10 years. While not a catastrophe, experts say this is a higher average rate than 70% of other countries. The Reserve Bank says this results in South Africa's price level being 60% higher than it was in 2015. In other words, something that would have cost 60 Rand 10 years ago now costs 100 Rand. Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago says South Africa is finishing at the bottom of the class for growth and inflation. Kganyago says South Africa is not getting the report card any country wants. He adds that a handful of countries that have performed worse than South Africa over the past decade have been those that suffered major disasters such as war and macroeconomic collapse. To talk more about this, we're now joined by economist Thokozile Madonko. Thokozile, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Monetary policy instruments are what we use to respond to inflation, or at least the rise in inflation. But it is the confluence of fiscal, industrial and trade economic policies that are meant to affect the rate of inflation as a leading input, not as, of course, a response to it. Is 3.5% worrisome, a 0.5% rise year on year compared to, say, June? But more importantly, are we utilizing the confluence of fiscal, industrial and trade policy correctly in making sure that we don't have runaway inflation when there are no other externalities that should lead to that?
Good evening, and good evening to your viewers. So the answer to your question to a certain extent is really it depends. And so it's a fairly complex mix of, as you've rightly put, monetary, fiscal and industrial policy. And what we've seen, at least since 2012, or some would argue post the 2008 financial crisis, is that South Africa has not been pursuing a macroeconomic policy, including industrial policy, that is fit for purpose. And I would argue that the current policy mix that's being implemented has resulted in the crisis that we're facing now and that South Africans are facing in terms of a cost of living crisis. So the picture around inflation targeting is that given that we are a middle income country, that we have the highest inequality in the world, is it appropriate for the South African Reserve Bank to be targeting a 3% inflation rate? Some would argue, and I would agree with those who argue, that this is irresponsible. And a colleague of mine at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, where I'm based, has put out a paper on why there are risks to this kind of inflation targeting. And part of the story around inflation is that we can handle higher inflation if we have higher wages. And so that then speaks to the role of the private sector in making sure that they are sharing the burden of the crises that we face by making sure that they're remunerating workers, particularly workers at the lower end. So I'm not talking about your CEOs and so forth, but your average worker who has really seen their real wages stagnate. And then when we talk about those who are dependent, and a large percentage of South African households are dependent on the grants, they have seen a real deflation, loss in the real value of their purchasing power with the grants because of the high cost of living. So it's also about, a complex question around price gouging. What are these companies doing? We have a very concentrated market in South Africa with huge kind of concentration with big companies that can control prices to a certain extent. Companies that are also not remunerating workers fairly or justly to enable them to cater for the cost of living increases. Yeah. So we could tolerate a certain amount of inflation if wages increased above inflation, but we haven't seen that happen, and that's in the context of low growth, climate change and so forth.
Yeah, many argue that wages have remained flat because our industrial output just hasn't grown over the last decade, perhaps over the last 2 decades. The ongoing debate between your orthodox colleagues and some of the heterodox scholars that you work alongside is the argument that it is not wages or industrial policy necessarily that will drive it, but rather the input factor, such as capital, that need to be answered. And the capital question is, do we have a debt growth, a debt-born growth a trajectory in South Africa, or do we have a more organic growth trajectory in South Africa? How do we answer the growth question? What are the input variables and factors to consider?
So one of the things that we've written about, and it's based on a piece of research by the heterodox economist, feminist economist, based in Greenwich University. And we saw that we actually need, at this time, if you follow a kind of stimulus package, so that's the heterodox kind of component, that government has a role to play in the economy. And that
even if
in
it's
order
debt
to
financed,
stimulate the private sector, we need a shot in the arm, essentially, and not austerity and inflation targeting, which is what we have at the moment. So there are those that are benefiting from the status quo, and we see companies having super profits and doing very, very well. Our big companies, minerals especially, they do very, very well. But we also need to look at our tax mix, and we've also changed our revenue mix quite fundamentally since 1994. And we used to have a higher corporate income tax. We had higher personal income tax at the higher brackets, not again at the lower brackets, but at the higher brackets. We've actually reduced that and then turned to indirect taxes, which fuels inflation, by the way, in terms of value-added tax, fuel levies, and so forth. So it is a kind of perfect storm that we need to unpack and say that actually government does have a role to play in the economy, and we should be in, and this is the point that we raise in the paper, is that one of the shots in the arm that is needed to get our economy going is to invest in social infrastructure. And what do I mean by social infrastructure? So the care economy, so looking at education infrastructure, health infrastructure, so jobs as well as physical buildings, that would stimulate public transport. So not these big ticket kind of infrastructure projects of new power stations that are going to be stranded assets in the future, but real kind of engagement. And there's good research that the multiplier effect in investing in education, health, social protection, social development, so teachers, doctors, police, that has a better return on investment than, say, building a power station, for example.
Yeah, well, of course, there's also the contradiction of, if you have an economy, you need to power it up, but you also need to have, you also need the power to be able to get the economy going, and that's the egg and the chicken question of economics. But we're going to have to leave it there. Thokozile, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Always fantastic speaking to you. Thokozile Madonko is an economist.